The rain poured relentlessly, drenching the quiet streets of the small town as Sophia stood trembling under the flickering streetlight. Her thin, soaked clothes clung to her skin, and her fingers clutched a tattered bag that carried all she had left. At 13 years old, Sophia should have been home, laughing with her family, safe within the warm embrace of those who loved her. But tonight, she was utterly alone. Her father's voice still thundered in her mind, each word cutting deeper than the one before. "You've disgraced this family. Sophia. Get out and never come back." He had slammed his fist against the table with such force it made the plates rattle. Sophia had pleaded, her voice hoarse with desperation. But her mother had only looked at her with cold disdain. "Don't waste your tears," her mother had said, her tone devoid of empathy. "You made your choices. Now live with them." The echoes of their condemnation followed her as she wandered aimlessly through the rain-soaked streets. Every door she knocked on was met with rejection. One man at an abandoned house yelled, "We don't need your kind here. Get lost." Another slammed the door in her face before she could even finish her plea. The world seemed determined to turn its back on her. The park became her refuge as night deepened. Sophia curled up on a cold metal bench, her small frame trembling as icy rain seeped into her bones. Clutching her stomach protectively, she whispered to the life growing within her. "I'm so sorry," she murmured, tears mixing with the rain. "I don't know how we'll survive this." The darkness around her felt endless, heavy with despair. But just as her exhaustion began to pull her into unconsciousness, a faint voice broke through the storm. "Child, what are you doing out here?" Sophia's vision blurred as she looked up. An elderly woman stood above her, holding a large, battered umbrella. Her eyes, though lined with age, glimmered with warmth and concern. Before Sophia could respond, her strength gave out, and she collapsed into the stranger's arms. "Don't be afraid," the woman said softly, her voice a beacon of comfort. "You're safe now." Sophia woke to the gentle sound of a kettle whistling and the soft hum of rain against a nearby window. For a brief moment, she didn't remember where she was. The warmth of the room and the comforting aroma of baked bread seemed foreign to her senses, which had grown accustomed to the biting cold of the streets. Slowly, her gaze settled on the modest surroundings, a small kitchen filled with neatly arranged jars and utensils. The faint glow of a lamp cast a soothing light over the room. "Good. You're awake," said a warm voice, pulling her from her thoughts. The elderly woman from the night before stood by the stove, her frail figure moving with quiet efficiency. "I've made you some tea. It'll help warm you up." Sophia tried to sit up, but her body ached from the cold and exhaustion. The woman noticed her struggle and hurried over, placing a steady hand on Sophia's shoulder. "Easy, child. You've been through quite an ordeal." The woman introduced herself as Margaret, a retired baker who lived alone above her shop. She had found Sophia shivering in the rain and couldn't bear to leave her there. "You looked like a lost bird," Margaret said with a soft smile. "I couldn't just walk away." Sophia took the offered tea, her trembling hands struggling to hold the warm cup. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. As Sophia sipped the tea, her thoughts drifted back to her parents' harsh words, the cruel stares of strangers, and the relentless rain that had seemed to echo her despair. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. "I don't deserve this kindness," she murmured, her voice breaking. Margaret sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on Sophia's. "Everyone deserves kindness, my dear," she said firmly. "Whatever mistakes you think you've made, they don't define you." Sophia cried openly then, the weight of her pain pouring out in heaving sobs. Margaret held her through it all, whispering words of reassurance. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sophia felt a sliver of hope, a fragile, fleeting thing, but real nonetheless. The next few days passed in quiet recovery. Margaret insisted Sophia stay in the bakery's spare room, despite the younger girl's protests. "You need rest," Margaret said firmly. "You can't face the world on an empty stomach and tired legs." Sophia began helping around the bakery as her strength returned. though her movements were timid and her gaze often downcast. She found solace in the rhythm of kneading dough and arranging pastries. Margaret, ever patient, guided her with gentle words and steady hands. But even within the warmth of the bakery, shadows lingered. Customers whispered as they noticed Sophia's presence, their judgmental eyes cutting through her fragile confidence. "Who is she?" they'd ask. "Why is Margaret keeping her here?" Margaret, unbothered by the gossip, stood her ground. "What I do in my bakery is my business," she'd say, her voice firm but calm. Yet, Sophia couldn't ignore the murmurs, the looks, the sense of being unwelcome. One evening, as the two sat by the fireplace, Margaret handed Sophia a small loaf of bread. "You've got a fire inside you, child," she said, her voice steady. "Don't let the world snuff it out." Sophia looked at Margaret, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "I'll try," she whispered. For the first time in weeks, her lips curled into a faint, tentative smile. Sophia stepped carefully into the quiet bakery, her heart heavy with gratitude but shadowed by unease. The whispers and stares from Margaret's customers grew louder each day, their judgment a persistent reminder of the world's cruelty. Though Margaret had assured her time and again that she was welcome, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that her presence was a burden. One afternoon, as she wiped the counters and arranged fresh pastries, the doorbell jingled sharply. A man stepped inside, his heavy coat brushing against the doorframe. He was tall, with a stern expression that matched the coldness of the winter wind he brought with him. Sophia froze, recognizing him as Esteban, the owner of the grocery store down the street, a man known for his sharp tongue and prying nature. "Margaret," Esteban called out, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on Sophia. His eyes narrowed, and he took a deliberate step closer. "We need to talk." Margaret emerged from the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour and her usual warm smile in place. "Esteban," she greeted, her voice steady, though a flicker of tension passed across her face. "What can I do for you?" Esteban pointed directly at Sophia, his tone dripping with disdain. "Do you know who she is? The whole neighborhood is talking. A girl like her doesn't belong here. She's trouble." Sophia's heart sank, her hands trembling as she clutched the rag she'd been using. She kept her gaze down, unwilling to meet Esteban's glare but feeling the weight of his words all the same. Margaret straightened her back, her voice firm. "What I do in my bakery is none of your business. Esteban, if you've come to buy bread, you're welcome. If not, I suggest you leave." Esteban's lips curled into a sneer. "I'm just saying, Margaret. Your reputation's on the line. People are starting to question why you're sheltering someone like her. You could lose customers over this." Sophia felt tears sting her eyes, shame burning through her as she fought to keep her composure. Margaret, however, remained unshaken. She stepped closer to Esteban, her expression unwavering. "If people choose not to buy my bread because I've helped someone in need, so be it. But I will not abandon this girl. Now, unless you have something else to say, you can see yourself out." Esteban muttered something under his breath but left without another word. The door closed behind him with a sharp click, leaving the bakery in heavy silence. Sophia's shoulders slumped, and she whispered, "I'm sorry, Margaret, I didn't mean to cause you trouble." Margaret turned to her, her gaze softening. "You have nothing to apologize for, Sophia. People will always find reasons to judge. But that doesn't mean we give in to them." Sophia nodded, though the lump in her throat remained. She resumed her work, determined to help in any way she could. But Esteban's words lingered in her mind, a constant reminder of her precarious place in the world. That night, as she lay in bed, the bakery quiet and dark, Sophia stared at the ceiling, the weight of her fears pressing down on her. "I'll find a way to repay her," she whispered to herself. "I have to." The days that followed Esteban's visit were marked by a palpable tension in the bakery. Though Margaret stood firm in her resolve, Sophia couldn't ignore the subtle changes. Fewer customers came in, and the cheerful buzz that had once filled the small space was now replaced by whispers and sidelong glances. Sophia kept her head down, working diligently, but every judgmental stare felt like a dagger. One afternoon, as Sophia swept the floor, the bell above the door jingled sharply. She looked up to see Carlos, a rough-looking man from the neighborhood, swaggering in with two friends. Their smirk sent a chill down her spine. "What can I do for you?" Margaret asked, stepping forward with her usual composure. Carlos leaned against the counter, his gaze fixed on Sophia. "We're just here to chat. Heard you've been harboring someone interesting." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "If you're not here to buy bread, I suggest you leave." Carlos ignored her, stepping closer to Sophia. "What about you? Little girl, aren't you going to say hello?" Sophia clenched the broom tightly, her knuckles white. "Please, leave us alone." Carlos chuckled darkly. "We're not here to cause trouble. Just wanted to remind you that not everyone in this neighborhood appreciates your company." "Enough." Margaret's voice cut through the tension like a blade. She grabbed a broom from behind the counter and pointed it at Carlos. "Get out before I call the police." Carlos raised his hands in mock surrender, smirking. "No need to get feisty, old lady. We're leaving." He glanced back at Sophia. "But don't get too comfortable. This bakery might not be here much longer." As the doors slammed shut behind them, Sophia sank onto a chair, her hands trembling. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. This is all my fault." Margaret knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Don't you dare say that. None of this is your fault. They're cowards who thrive on intimidation. We won't let them win." But despite Margaret's words, the incident left an indelible mark on both of them. That evening, after the bakery had closed, Margaret sat at the table, her head in her hands. Sophia watched her from across the room, guilt gnawing at her. Margaret had given her everything, yet it seemed she was only bringing trouble into the kind woman's life. "I'll leave," Sophia whispered, breaking the silence. "If I go, maybe they'll stop." Margaret looked up, her eyes sharp with determination. "You're not going anywhere. This is your home, Sophia. We'll face this together." Sophia nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice breaking. That night, as Sophia lay in bed, she made a silent promise to herself. No matter what it took, she would find a way to repay Margaret's kindness. She would prove that she was worth the fight. Sophia woke up to the soft sound of rain pattering against the window. The bakery was quiet, and the scent of freshly baked bread lingered in the air. She stretched, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in her chest since Carlos's visit. Margaret was already in the kitchen, kneading dough with a focused expression. Despite her steady hands, the lines of worry etched into her face were unmistakable. "Good morning, Ba," Sophia greeted softly, using the affectionate term she had come to call Margaret. It felt right, a way to acknowledge the maternal figure who had done so much for her. Margaret looked up, her gaze softening. "Good morning, child. Did you sleep well?" Sophia hesitated, then nodded. "As well as I could." Margaret paused, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sophia, we can't let fear control us. This bakery is our home, and no one has the right to take that away." Sophia smiled faintly, but the guilt in her eyes was clear. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect this place, Ba." Margaret returned to her work, but her movements seemed heavier than usual. Sophia noticed and decided to push aside her fears, focusing on helping. She grabbed a rolling pin and began flattening dough, her movements precise and determined. If they were going to keep this bakery running, she would do everything she could to contribute. As the day wore on, customers trickled in, some offering kind words, others delivering sharp stares and whispered judgments. Sophia kept her head high, refusing to let the negativity seep in. But when a particularly cruel comment floated through the air, her resolve wavered. "Isn't that the girl who caused all the trouble? I heard the bakery's losing business because of her." Margaret stepped forward, her voice firm and unwavering. "If you have a problem, you're welcome to take your business elsewhere." The customer huffed but left without further comment. Margaret turned to Sophia, her eyes blazing with protectiveness. "Don't listen to them. They don't know you. They don't know your heart." Sophia nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She busied herself with cleaning the counters, her hands shaking slightly. She hated that Margaret had to defend her, hated that her presence seemed to bring so much trouble. Later that evening, as the bakery quieted down, Margaret sat at the table with a stack of unpaid bills. Sophia joined her, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of them. "We'll find a way," Margaret said, her voice soft but resolute. We've come this far. We won't give up now. Sophia reached across the table, placing her hand over Margaret's. We'll get through this. Bah. Together, the two women sat in silence for a moment, their bond growing stronger with each shared struggle. Sophia's heart swelled with gratitude and determination. No matter what, she would fight for the woman who had given her a second chance at life. The bakery was unusually quiet that morning, the usual chatter of customers replaced by an uneasy stillness. Sophia stood at the window, her gaze distant as she watched the street outside. The neighborhood, once bustling with familiar faces, now seemed colder. Whispers of disapproval lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the judgment she and Margaret faced. Lost in thought again, Margaret's voice broke the silence as she placed a tray of freshly baked bread on the counter. Sophia turned, forcing a smile. Just thinking about how we can keep this place going. Margaret walked over and gently placed a hand on Sophia's shoulder. Worrying won't solve anything. We've weathered storms before, and we'll weather this one too. Sophia nodded, but her heart felt heavy. She busied herself with the morning chores, trying to shake the unease that clung to her. As she swept the floor, the doorbell jingled, signaling a customer's arrival. Looking up, Sophia saw a man she didn't recognize, a stranger with a sharp gaze and an air of authority. "Good morning," the man said, his tone neutral but firm. "I'm Detective Ramirez. May I speak with the owner?" Margaret stepped forward, her expression calm but wary. "I'm the owner. What can I do for you, Detective?" He glanced at Sophia briefly before turning back to Margaret. "We've received complaints about disturbances in the area, and I wanted to check in. Is everything all right here?" Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "Everything is fine, Detective, but I suspect you're not here for a loaf of bread." The detective's lips twitched in a faint smile, but his demeanor remained professional. "Just doing my job, ma'am. If there's anything you'd like to report, now would be the time." Sophia stiffened, her mind flashing back to Carlos and his threats. She exchanged a glance with Margaret, who gave her a subtle nod. "We've had some trouble," Margaret admitted. "A few locals seem to think they can intimidate us into closing, but we're not giving up." Detective Ramirez took out a notebook, jotting down notes as Margaret spoke. "Did these individuals threaten you directly?" he asked, his tone serious. Sophia hesitated, the memory of Carlos's sneer and the destruction he caused flooding back. "Yes," she said quietly. "They've been harassing us, saying things like we don't belong here." Ramirez looked up, his gaze sharp. "You have every right to be here. I'll make sure a patrol car comes by regularly. If anything happens, call me immediately." Margaret thanked him, and he handed her a business card before leaving. As the door closed behind him, Sophia let out a shaky breath. "Do you think he can help?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. Margaret smiled faintly. "We'll see. But at least someone knows now. That's a start." The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the encounter with the detective lingered in Sophia's mind. That evening, as she and Margaret sat together, the weight of their shared struggles seemed a little lighter. For the first time in weeks, Sophia allowed herself to hope that things might get better. The following morning, the bakery was bathed in golden sunlight, but an undercurrent of tension still lingered. Sophia moved through her tasks methodically, her hands trembling slightly as she kneaded dough. Margaret, noticing her unease, approached with a steaming cup of tea. "You didn't sleep well," Margaret said softly, placing the cup on the counter. Sophia nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every sound last night made me jump. I kept thinking, what if they come back?" Margaret sighed, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "Let them try. We're not alone anymore, Sophia. That detective promised to keep an eye on us. And you have me." Sophia managed a small smile, but the fear still lingered. As the hours passed, a few regular customers trickled in, their kind words and purchases providing a much-needed distraction. However, just as the day seemed to settle into a rhythm, the doorbell jingled again. Carlos stepped inside, his smirk immediately darkening the room's atmosphere. He wasn't alone, two of his friends followed, their postures radiating menace. Sophia froze, her heart pounding as Margaret stepped forward. "What do you want now?" Margaret demanded, her tone firm despite her smaller frame. Carlos feigned innocence, spreading his arms. "We're just here to buy some bread. Isn't that what a bakery is for?" Margaret didn't move. Her gaze unwavering. If you're here to cause trouble, you'd better leave. We've already informed the police. Carlos's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. The police? He chuckled, but it lacked conviction. You think that scares me? Nobody cares about this place. Margaret took a step closer, her voice rising. We care. And so do our customers. Now get out before I call them again. Sophia watched, her admiration for Margaret growing with each passing second. She wanted to stand beside her, to show the same bravery, but fear kept her rooted to the spot. Just as the standoff seemed ready to escalate, the doorbell rang again. This time, Detective Ramirez entered, his presence instantly shifting the atmosphere. Is there a problem here? Ramirez's voice was calm but carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. Carlos's smirk disappeared entirely. He glanced at his friends, then back at Ramirez, and scoffed. No problem. We were just leaving. The trio shuffled out, their confidence noticeably shaken. Ramirez watched them go before turning to Margaret and Sophia. Are you both okay? He asked, his concern genuine. Margaret nodded, her shoulders relaxing for the first time that day. Thanks to you, Detective. Ramirez gave a small nod. I'll keep checking in. Don't hesitate to call if they come back. After he left, Sophia finally found her voice. How do you stay so strong? Bah. Margaret turned to her, her expression softening. Because I've learned that fear only wins if you let it. And I refuse to let it win. That evening, as Sophia closed the bakery, she felt a small spark of hope rekindle. For the first time, she believed they might truly overcome this together. The days that followed were quieter, but a lingering unease shadowed Sophia's steps. Though Detective Ramirez's visits brought some comfort, the threats Carlos had made left a mark she couldn't shake. Still, the bakery continued to open each morning, the comforting scent of freshly baked bread wafting into the neighborhood. One crisp morning, a woman entered the bakery, her well-worn coat and cautious demeanor marking her as a new face in the community. Sophia greeted her warmly, noting the hesitation in her movements as she glanced around the small shop. Good morning. How can I help you? Sophia asked with a gentle smile. The woman hesitated before replying, her voice soft. I heard this place has the best bread in town. Sophia chuckled lightly. You heard right. Let me wrap up a loaf for you. As Sophia prepared the order, the woman's eyes wandered, landing on the photographs lining the counter. They were simple snapshots of the bakery's history, Margaret standing proudly beside the first oven, customers smiling with their purchases, and, more recently, Sophia holding a tray of pastries. You seem happy here, the woman said, her voice tinged with something Sophia couldn't quite place. Sophia paused, meeting the woman's gaze. It's not always easy, but this place has become home. The woman nodded, her expression softening. It shows. Keep going. No matter what. The exchange left Sophia thoughtful. As the woman left, clutching her warm loaf of bread, Sophia couldn't help but feel a flicker of encouragement from the stranger's words. It was a reminder that even amid struggles, their efforts were noticed. Later that day, Margaret returned from a short trip to the market, her arms laden with ingredients. She placed the bags on the counter and glanced at Sophia, her face glowing with quiet determination. I ran into Mr. Daniels, the landlord, Margaret said. He's agreed to give us more time for the rent. Sophia's eyes widened. How? I thought he was adamant about the deadline. Margaret's smile held a mix of pride and defiance. I reminded him that this bakery is more than just a business. It's a part of this community, and letting it close would hurt everyone. Sophia felt a swell of gratitude and awe. Margaret's unyielding spirit was a beacon, illuminating the path forward when it seemed darkest. As evening fell, Sophia stood by the window, watching the fading sunlight cast a golden glow over the street. A child's laughter echoed faintly in the distance, mingling with the hum of life that carried on outside. Despite everything, a sense of peace began to settle over her. Margaret joined her, placing a warm hand on her shoulder. We'll get through this, Sophia. Together. Sophia nodded, her voice steady. Together. The small bakery, with its modest walls and creaky floors, was more than a place of work. It was a sanctuary, a testament to resilience, kindness, and the quiet strength of those who refused to give up. The next morning, a soft rain pattered against the windows of the bakery, casting a gentle rhythm over the quiet street. Inside, Sophia worked with meticulous focus, kneading dough and shaping rolls while Margaret prepared the oven. The atmosphere was warm, almost serene, despite the lingering tension from recent events. Midway through the morning rush, the bell over the door jingled. A young boy, no older than 10, entered hesitantly, clutching a crumpled dollar bill in his hand. His shoes were worn, and his jacket hung loosely on his small frame. "Good morning," Sophia greeted, her voice bright and welcoming. "What can I get for you?" The boy looked up shyly, his eyes flickering to the array of pastries behind the counter. "How much is the smallest loaf?" he asked softly. Sophia's heart tightened. She glanced at Margaret, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "For you. It's free," Sophia said, placing a warm loaf into a bag and handing it over with a smile. The boy's eyes widened in surprise. "Really? Thank you so much." "Ma'am," he said, clutching the bag tightly before darting out the door. Margaret chuckled, her gaze following the boy. "You remind me so much of myself at your age," she said. "Always giving. Even when you have so little." Sophia turned back to her work, her cheeks flushing slightly. "If we can't share kindness, what's the point of all this?" The rest of the day passed without incident until late afternoon, when a familiar, unwelcome figure appeared at the door, Carlos. His expression was smug, his stance casual yet menacing. Sophia's hands froze mid-motion, the tension in the room palpable. Margaret was the first to speak. "What do you want?" she demanded, her tone sharp and unwavering. Carlos smirked, leaning against the counter. "Just checking in, wanted to see how business is going." "You're not welcome here," Sophia said firmly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Carlos's gaze shifted to her, his smirk widening. "Still as feisty as ever. But remember, this bakery's reputation can change with just a few whispers." Margaret stepped forward, her frail figure radiating strength. "Get out, Carlos. Now. Or I'll make sure the authorities know exactly who's been causing trouble." For a moment, Carlos hesitated, his bravado faltering. Then he scoffed, throwing up his hands. "Fine. I'm leaving. But don't think this is over." As he disappeared into the rain, Sophia exhaled shakily, her knees nearly giving out. Margaret placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Don't let him get to you, Sophia. People like him thrive on fear." Sophia nodded, drawing strength from Margaret's resolve. "He won't win. Not this time." That evening, as they closed up, Sophia and Margaret sat together by the fire, sharing stories and quiet laughter. Though the day had been fraught with challenges, the warmth of their bond reminded them of what they were fighting for, a life built on resilience, hope, and love. The bakery's small dining area was filled with the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread as neighbors gathered, their conversations humming softly. Margaret stood by the counter, her smile as warm as the loaves in the oven, while Sophia worked diligently, her movements purposeful yet graceful. It had taken months of perseverance, but the bakery had become a haven, a symbol of resilience and kindness. A bell jingled as the door swung open, and a familiar face appeared. Isabella stepped inside, her expression hesitant yet hopeful. She clutched a small basket of fresh flowers, her hands trembling slightly. Sophia looked up, their eyes meeting across the room. For a moment, the air felt still, as if the entire bakery was holding its breath. Margaret gently nudged Sophia forward. "Go on," she whispered, her voice encouraging. Sophia wiped her hands on her apron, taking slow, deliberate steps toward her mother. "Isabella," she began, her tone measured. "What brings you here today?" Isabella extended the basket, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I wanted to thank you," she said softly, "for allowing me to be a part of your life again. For giving me a second chance." Sophia hesitated before reaching out to take the basket. Her hands brushed against her mother's. A fleeting but powerful connection. "I'm not doing this just for you," she said quietly. "I'm doing it for Anna. And for myself." Tears spilled down Isabella's cheeks, her voice breaking as she replied, "That's more than I could ever hope for." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the bakery. The three women, Sophia, Margaret, and Isabella, stood together. Their differences momentarily set aside. Anna skipped toward them, her laughter ringing through the room like music, bringing a sense of completeness to the scene. This was not a perfect ending. But it was a beginning, one built on forgiveness, love, and the unyielding strength of women who had faced life's harshest trials and chosen to rise.